You're listening to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, where we do fast, fun, free daily deep dives into books of the Bible. And right now, we're going through Esther.
All right, last time around, we started talking about how there are two different ancient versions of Esther. There's a really old one that dates back probably really close to the event it describes. That one is derived from Hebrew. We're reading the English translation of it as we work through this whole thing together here on this podcast. And then a couple of centuries later, there are some Greek additions to the existing text of the book of Esther. And everybody agrees that those are additions. Everybody agrees that they came after the fact. What everybody doesn't agree on is which one you ought to be reading. Catholics and Orthodox include the Greek additions to Esther in their Bibles. Protestants and Jews do not include the later additions to Esther in their Bibles. And there is absolutely no point whatsoever in me trying to hide my biases here. I'm profoundly convinced that we should be reading the original version of Esther and not the one that includes the later Greek additions. And you could probably tell that as soon as we started working through the book of Esther and we weren't using the version with the later Greek additions. But it doesn't mean I think that everybody who does it differently is stupid or bad or evil or wants to destroy Christianity or doesn't respect the Bible. They just got a different read on how the Bible happened and how it is best thought of. And look, maybe right now there are some people who are like, well, I can tell you right now, any later addition to a book shouldn't be included in that book of the Bible. But I think editing is a part of the process of the Bible coming to be, at least sometimes. I mean, I don't think any of us are threatened by the editing process in the Psalms. Those weren't all written by one person. There's clearly an aggregation factor involved in the Proverbs. Those Proverbs aren't all by one person. And when you look through the first 5 books of the Bible, I mean, Moses is credited as having written those, but he's dead at the end of one of those, and there's still more written down there. So clearly some later editor or scribe came in and finished out that story. Maybe it was Joshua. Now, when you get into the New Testament, to me, it looks more like what you're seeing there is what was written down by the people who wrote it. I suspect it is possible that there is a little bit at the end of the book of John, John being the apostle in the New Testament who lived the longest. And I imagine he had an opportunity to see his gospel in circulation. And it looks like there were questions that arose in the first century about the fate of Peter and what to do with Peter's leadership and his role and his influence. And I don't think it's crazy to think that John added to his own gospel a little bit later in life to clarify how things ended up playing out with Peter as soon as he found out that, hey, there's a question about this. So the idea of biblical inspiration and how God works hand in hand with the human authors is, I mean, it's incarnational, right? It's like the idea of Jesus taking on flesh. The whole relationship between God and man is very incarnational in nature, and at times that makes it a little bit tricky in terms of exactly how the processes work. So what I'm saying is, if you are a Christian who believes in the inspiration of the Bible, as we have it in front of us, then you also believe that God used some sort of editorial process, at times really overtly in the Bible, and at times more discreetly in the Bible, to get this stuff to the final form that ends up being in front of us that we read today. Maybe there are Christians somewhere who believe that God magically took the biblical authors by the scruff of the neck and was like, write this down, these words exactly. But that is not the historic Christian Orthodox position at all. The historic position is that God supernaturally guided the authors of Scripture along, and that the fusion we see between God ordaining exactly what he wanted to be communicated in these documents and the personality and circumstances of the human writing it and the audience who would receive it, that these things somehow, they come together, they fuse to produce exactly what God wanted to produce. Now, of course, I know there are a bunch of you who are listening to this and you're like, well, none of this is really a concern for me because I don't think the Bible necessarily is from God. And to you, I would say, I just continue to be super grateful that you're here and you're willing to hang out with someone who does think the Bible is from God. And I want you to know that I see you and I like you and I appreciate you being here and having this conversation with somebody who is operating from a different foundational assumption about the nature of the text. Okay, all of that said, when you look at the Hebrew version of Esther, it's not hard to see why it happened and what they were trying to accomplish with it. We talked about this a bunch in the last episode. And when you look at what happens historically over the few hundred years between the Hebrew version and the later Greek editions, it's not hard to see what they're going for with those later Greek editions, what kind of reframing the people who did that were attempting to achieve. So we've already talked several times about how Xerxes dies at the hands of court intrigue with eunuchs, and there's a crisis of succession. Artaxerxes eventually emerges. He's a very stable king as well. There are some later relatively stable kings also in the Achaemenid dynasty, but it's kind of downhill once we get into the late 400s and early 300s. And by the time you get into the 330s, you're down to a guy named Darius III, still an Achaemenid, but the strain of the weight of that massive empire is finally starting to take its toll, and Persia is vulnerable. Now, at this point, we are past the material that is covered in the Bible, though it looks like there are a couple of places that reference forward to the stuff that I'm about to tell you about. Along comes Alexander the Great. He's Macedonian, but he's Greek-ish. He has this vision to conquer Persia and Greekify the whole world. He defeats Darius III at a couple of key battles, Gaugamela and Issus. He also defeats all of the Greeks who used to fight against the Persians. I mean, all of your Athens, Thebes, Sparta, all of that crowd, they all end up bending the knee to Alexander as well. So he's really a very grand conqueror. He conquers Jerusalem bloodlessly, albeit. And so all of a sudden, once Alexander rolls through for the first time in hundreds of years, Jerusalem is no longer Persian. It's, I guess, Macedonian for a little while. Alexander goes to Egypt and founds, drum roll please, you're never going to see this one coming, Alexandria. And then he chases down and defeats, as I referenced earlier, Darius III. He conquers Babylon, and then he goes on to Susa, where the book of Esther is set. And there at Susa, he has this great big mass wedding where Alexander marries some Persian princesses and marries a bunch of his Greek and Macedonian soldiers off to a whole bunch of Persians, the idea being that we're going to put the whole world together. And this wasn't a complete forcing together of the whole world, because Greek and Persia had been informing each other for centuries. I mean, Xerxes isn't a Persian name. That's the Greek version of the name. The Hebrews called him Ahasuerus, as we've talked about a little bit as well. So there's a big time mingling of culture and language and all of this. Remember, the Persians themselves were a minority, an ethnic minority within their own empire. So really, Alexander's just formalizing something that has been the way it is for a really long time. Well, Alexander decides he wants to go and try to conquer India as well. That doesn't go well. He limps back to Babylon and dies in late spring, June of 323 BC. He does not name an heir. As a result, Alexander's generals divide up the freshly conquered empire, and wherever Jews might happen to live, they are now subjects of a brand new Greekish-looking empire created over the top of the old Persian infrastructure, wherever that might be. Well, over the next couple hundred years, because of push and pull factors, social osmotic factors, a whole bunch of Jews end up in Alexandria. They dominate a whole quarter of the city, and by the time Rome is on the scene, there are more Jews living in Alexandria than there are in Jerusalem. Alexandria is a cosmopolitan dynamo of a city. At this point, it has surpassed Susa as the greatest city in the ancient world. It's not Jerusalem, it's not Rome, it's certainly not Athens or Sparta. Surely Alexandria is the jewel of the ancient world at this point. Of course, they built a grand, elaborate, famous library there, the goal of which was to house every document, every history, every work of science, everything that had ever been written in the entire world. And if that library had not burned, our relationship with the ancient world would be completely different today. History would have unfolded differently. Progress would have unfolded differently, but tragically, it did burn. But it hadn't burned yet in the 200s BC during this era of Jewish flourishing in Alexandria. And it is here during this time that a need arises for a Greek version of the Old Testament, of the Jewish scriptures. And this is going to have to be a two-part conversation to work all the way through this story, so I'm just going to abruptly hit pause right there, and we'll pick up right where we left off tomorrow. So abrupt, so abrupt. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.